Chris, I appreciate the time. Thank you for the opportunity. Let me make sure I'm sharing the correct screen. It appears that I am. And welcome everyone. Good morning to those of you who reside in the central part of the U.S. I am on the East Coast, so it's technically afternoon for me. It's always a pleasure to get an opportunity to interact with individuals like yourselves that do have some level of impact on farmer behavior, and I suspect that we have some farmers in the audience as well. So hopefully this is an opportunity to look at these things from a little bit broader perspective. That's part of the challenge in the execution of my job on a day-to-day basis is recognizing what the science says with regard to what is a best practice, and it is largely dictated by where you are geographically, and that's going to include the crops that you're growing, the soils that you're operating on, and the growing environment that you have to deal with. That's probably the biggest challenge that I have from day to day. And part of what we try to do with the eKonomics website is to take some of that geographic information that we know is accessible, that we know is out there in the academic space, and put it into a form that is hopefully a little bit more approachable for the layperson that doesn't necessarily have a PhD after their name or even a master's of science after their name. Just trying to make that information as usable as we possibly can. So again, thank you for the opportunity. eKonomics is proud to partner with ASA and Triple SA in this endeavor. So let's get started on the topic at hand today. This is only the second time I've actually done this talk. I've actually done it a few times internally, but this is only the second time that I've done it to an external group. So you're getting a little bit of my perspective, and as I often say, a little bit of my bias with regard to where we are on the nitrogen landscape. So I'm going to tackle both the policy side. I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about what the policy desires are with regard to nitrogen direction ultimately what we're talking about, the upper Mississippi River Basin. Some of the goals that have been set that are specific to targets for the hypoxic zone that forms in the Gulf of Mexico every summer. How do we reach a level where we see that hypoxic zone shrink? That's not going to be the focus of the conversation. I'm going to take this more back into the upper Mississippi and spend some time talking about, okay, what are some of the specific reductions that have been identified within certain states? So that's what we're gonna be talking about today. Let me switch this so I can use my laser pointer just to make it a little bit easier. So what are the goals? And again, the objective of this conversation and this presentation is not necessarily to throw holes or to throw darts at what has been stated as the objectives for nutrient loss reduction. It's just more of a statement of what has been identified to date for what those goals should look like. We will spend a little bit of time talking about the difficulty of achieving the goals that have been stated, and that's really when we start talking about the scientific realities of how we manage nitrogen. So, what do we know on the academic and agronomic side with regard to nitrogen rate response? Just how accurate can we be at providing nitrogen recommendations? There's a lot to be said there. I'm trying to target and focus this as much as I possibly can, because to be really honest, we could spend 3 to 4 hours, and I've done that in the past, talking about how to do a better job of making nitrogen rate decisions. And there are some limitations. There are also some opportunities. And then we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about timing. So what if we could just do a better job of timing nitrogen applications? What sort of improvement in efficiency, not just from a yield perspective, that's obviously a major consideration when we start talking about changing agronomic practice at the field level, but also what would we possibly gain from an environmental outcome? Just how far down the path of achieving these nutrient reduction targets could we get if we just did a better job of timing that application of nitrogen? And then source. So what about enhanced efficiency products? You really can't have a conversation in this realm of dealing with the nitrogen realities without having some level of conversation about some of the enhanced efficiency products that we have in the space. They do have some opportunities, but they also have some limitations. And if you've probably caught on here, while I didn't come right out and say it, this is really a 4R kind of a conversation and a discussion related to how do we achieve these targets from the agronomic side. Now, I do include another option, and that is the non-nutrient option. And those are typically things like cover crops, rotation, although it is tied to nutrients. What other opportunities exist out there for us to achieve these goals? And then the bigger question ultimately becomes, are there adequate incentives to implement the practices that we think will help us reach these targets? But are they incentivized adequately enough to really promote adoption at the farm scale? And that is a conversation that is often not had. We have the scientific information that tells us that cover crops can deliver some sizable environmental benefits, specifically with regard to decreasing nitrate loading going into winter, and decreasing the amount of nitrate that may be potentially lost over our winter months going into the spring. But is there adequate economic incentive for a farmer to implement those practices? And we're going to have a little bit of that conversation. Again, with the time constraints that I do have, I'm just not going to have an opportunity to cover all of these to the degree that I genuinely would desire to. But that's okay, because for the sake of this conversation, I think this is going to at least move the conversation forward and maybe expose individuals to things that they have not seen before. So let's start with policymaker desire. And for those of you who don't know, I suspect all of us that live in the Midwest are fairly familiar with the nutrient loss reduction strategies that have been drafted. Not every state has drafted one. These 12 states have a nutrient loss reduction strategy in some form or another. Some are a little bit more developed than others, and that's okay. I'm going to rely pretty heavily on the I states. I'm going to talk a lot about Illinois today. I'm going to talk about Iowa, and I'm also going to talk about Minnesota. I'm not picking on anyone in particular. I'm just using those because they're a little bit farther down the path with regard to the development of what the nutrient loss reduction strategy ultimately looks like, what they've targeted as far as agronomic practice, and even other technologies that will help us achieve the targets that have been established. So everybody's probably familiar with what the upper Mississippi River Basin looks like. If you're not, this is a really good graphic. I can't remember who I stole this from, and I apologize. I'm normally pretty pedantic when it comes to identifying who I steal information from, but apparently when I was putting together the slide, I left somebody out. So if this happens to be your slide, I apologize. But this is a really nice visual of what the upper Mississippi looks like. So ultimately, every farmer practice that is implemented within this shaded geography representative of different river basins that constitute the upper Mississippi, we're going to have some impact all the way down into the Gulf of Mexico. And if you're familiar with where that hypoxic zone forms, the mouth of the Mississippi dumps here on the eastern side of Louisiana, and then that hypoxic zone forms back towards the west. So this is the geography that I'm going to be focused on today. And if by chance someone's cluing into this presentation and you're not represented geographically in this area, just recognize that many of the practices that we would promote to improve nitrogen utilization efficiency in this geography is pretty much going to work almost everywhere else. I happen to reside in the state of Ohio, and if you notice, the upper, I would say upper third, upper quarter of our state actually doesn't drain into the Mississippi. We actually drain into Lake Erie. That's a whole other presentation. It's a different nutrient that we have to deal with there. That's phosphorus. But just to sort of orient you geographically, when we're talking about the upper Mississippi River Basin, this is the geography that we're dealing with, and these are the 12 states that have at least drafted some form of a nutrient loss reduction strategy. So just what does that nutrient loss reduction strategy look like? So what are the desired goals? And again, the point of this slide is not to throw darts at the levels that have been established as far as goals. I'm never taken aback by an aspirational goal. It's not to say that I don't question whether or not it's achievable. That's a whole different question, but I think that there are valid reasons for the aspirational goals that have been established. Now ultimately, most of the desires have been established based upon a desired decrease in the hypoxic zone that forms in the Gulf of Mexico. So that's sort of what's been directing this endeavor or this target with regard to, okay, just what would we like to see achieved? So as you look at this, they want to see a 45% reduction by 2040 to levels that would have been relative to 1980 to 1996 averages. So whatever those values were, we want to see a 45% reduction. Now, to be fair, the targets that have been established and the desires that have been put forth don't just focus on agriculture, and that makes total sense. You think about the NPDES permitted facilities that operate across the entirety of this river basin. We have a lot of cities. They have a permit. They are allowed to discharge a certain amount of pollutant out of a wastewater treatment facility. You have industries that fall under the same guidelines. So it's not just agriculture that has been targeted, but it's also the municipalities and the industries that are represented in that geography as well. As you could probably guess, from the nitrogen side, we are identified as the primary driver of nitrogen being delivered into the Gulf of Mexico. I get a little nervous when I see this 52%. I'm not saying that it's an inaccurate representation. My suspicion is it's probably pretty close. But the question that I ultimately always ask is, how much of that is actually driven by active fertilization? And that'll make more sense as we get further and further into this presentation. There's a lot of things that we've done in the landscape in the upper Mississippi River Basin to make it one of the most productive agricultural geographies in the world. And one of those in a lot of this area is we have to deal with poorly drained soils. And one of the best ways to overcome that challenge is to introduce artificial drainage. And as soon as you introduce artificial drainage, you have introduced a shunt that basically takes waters that traditionally would not have made their way so easily and specifically so rapidly to surface waters, and now you've shunted that system. So I think a lot of the challenges that we face are because of the drainage, the extent of the drainage system that we have altered across the landscape. And again, I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing. In many respects, that's a good thing, because that's made soils that have been traditionally, or even not even traditionally, they would be unproductive if we didn't have some sort of an artificial drainage. So this 52%, I do wonder. So part of what we've introduced with artificial drainage is that shunt. Even if we didn't fertilize, and this will become fairly evident as I get through this presentation, even if we didn't fertilize, there's going to be some amount of loss from the agricultural system to a surface water. And again, that'll make more sense as we go into this. So we're not going to focus on phosphorus at all today. On the nitrogen side, this was that baseline period. We would like to attempt to achieve 20% reduction by 2025. It'll be interesting to see if we even get close to that. Surprising that's only 5 years away. That's not a very long time horizon for us to wait to see just how much of an impact we've had. And then ultimate desire is to achieve that 45% by 2040. Now, each state is responsible for identifying the practices that are going to be implemented to achieve the stated goals. And that makes total sense as you think about the diversity of agriculture that we do represent across the upper Mississippi River Basin. You tend to think of this as corn and soybean country. And for the bulk of what we're dealing with agriculturally, that's probably an accurate identifier. But the agronomic practices to maximize nutrient availability are going to be dramatically different depending upon where you're at within that geography. Even Southern Illinois, just thinking about Southern Illinois and Northern Iowa, and there's a reason I use those two, because I'm going to draw pretty heavily on some data here in a few moments. What needs to be implemented within those two different areas can be pretty dramatically different. So to that end, and we all recognize this as a scientific community, each one of these states have to be responsible for implementing, for identifying, and potentially and eventually implementing some of these practices to achieve the stated goals. It's a combination of a couple of different things. It's not just agronomic practice change. And if you look at the scientific data that exists, and we're going to spend some time on this afternoon, this morning, just simply changing agronomic practice is probably not going to get us to the stated objectives or the targets that have been identified. That's just the unfortunate reality of the system that we manage. There are other things that we've identified, and those are going to include conservation practices, things that we're all familiar with, cover crops, buffers, controlled drainage, changing cropping systems. the ultimate challenge becomes, so with regard to agronomic practice change, we're typically pointing to some, it's not just an agronomic consideration, it's also an economic consideration. So at least theoretically, if we make an improvement in agronomic practice that increases the efficiency of use of a nutrient, in this particular case, nitrogen, hopefully there's going to be some economic payback that's going to promote the adoption of that practice. That's not always true, but at least there's that ultimate opportunity for that to exist. For some of these conservation practices, that becomes a little bit more of a challenge. And there's some bigger issues at play, and these issues become even bigger when you start talking about edge of field treatment. So if we're talking about reintroduction or establishment of wetlands in a particular geography to deal with excess nitrate in a landscape, or the use of bioreactors, which have gotten a lot of traction here lately. There are some real challenges associated with the adoption and implementation of these technologies. We know they can provide a benefit, but just how do you pencil out the economics of implementing that practice? There's even bigger questions, and we're gonna focus on those as we get towards the end of the presentation. So the point of this is not to overwhelm you. I know there's a lot on this slide, and it's fairly busy. I'm going to try to condense this down really quickly, because a lot of the things that are presented here, we're going to be talking about in subsequent slides as we really delve into the science and really looking at what 4Rs can deliver, and where 4Rs have some challenges, where there are some limitations. But this is from Iowa State University. This is their nutrient loss reduction strategy. And again, I'm not picking on Iowa State University. That's often the case if you're one of the first ones out of the gate that starts putting pencil to paper and start trying to come up with, okay, just what could changing this agronomic practice, what could it deliver with regard to a nitrate nitrogen reduction? What would be the agronomic trade-off for adoption of that production practice? So anytime you're one of the first ones out there, you're going to get a lot of darts thrown at you, and that's okay. And I know the folks at Iowa State University, I'm not going to hurt their feelings. But this is what we're looking at, and what you really notice out at the outset is when you're just talking about straight agronomic practice. So that's going to be from this nitrification inhibitor on up. The potential percent nitrate reduction associated with changing these practices does not get you anywhere close to that 45% target that we're ultimately shooting for by 2040. So that's probably going to make you think that just changing agronomic practice is not going to be what's going to deliver or allow us to achieve what's been identified as a reduction target for nutrient loss. And I think that's probably a correct conclusion. We're going to talk a little bit about this. I think there are some opportunities, but I don't think just straight agronomic practice change is going to get us there, at least in the context of if we don't dramatically change cropping system. And again, I don't see a lot of economic incentive to do that. But what you do notice is where you start to see some practices that can be implemented at the farm level that do provide some benefit is introduction of cover crops. That's probably my air quotes, the easiest thing to do. Everybody's got their own perspective on cover crops. I certainly have mine. I'm going to try to avoid exposing you to all of my biases. At least if I do have a bias, I'll make sure that I point it out to you. But do recognize that cover crops have a potential. They don't work in every geography. That is, and when I say they don't work in every geography, there can be problems associated with establishment. That's certainly true here in Ohio. Southern Ohio, we can usually get a pretty good stand without too much effort. But as you move further north latitudinally, depending upon when you're trying to seed that cover crop, that can be a challenge. And it brings to mind some work that was done in the University of Minnesota back in the early 2000s. It might have been the late 90s, where they were having some issues with establishment of cover crops. Now, with some of the crops that we are establishing today, I think we've alleviated some of those challenges, but that's always a consideration that has to be made. But if you look at other things like edge of field treatment, talking about drainage water management, familiar a little bit with some of the techniques that have been promoted and even adopted to some scale. There are some agronomic challenges associated with really managing that water within that landscape. There's still some questions that are yet to be answered. I know there's a lot of good individuals that are doing work in that area. And then we look at things like wetlands and bioreactors. They have some real potential to help us achieve these targets. But again, my suspicion is these can be economically motivated at the farm level, with some understanding by the farmer, and some promotion by the retailer that's servicing that farmer client that can help us hit these values. These are going to be a little bit more of a challenge unless we have some sort of a subsidy in place to promote the adoption of these practices. And then again, you can't have this conversation about changing agronomic practice without having some conversation about, okay, what does this ultimately mean to the farmer? So anything that's a positive here, that's not negative, is going to be a net economic potential gain for the farmer. Okay, and again, you notice the broad range that's represented. This is part of the reality that we deal with as scientists, and that is we always tend to gravitate towards the average in the absence of better information. For good, bad, or indifferent, that's just the nature of science, and you're going to see that a lot as we get into this presentation. What I really found interesting, and again, I'm not throwing stones at the folks at Iowa State, and I'm not throwing stones at the folks at University of Minnesota, but University of Minnesota has a little bit different take. So they identify that just changing agronomic practices, if we can just do a better job of fertilizing, we can go a long way to what they've stated as their desired metric ton reduction of 18,000. They can get 11,000 of that by changing agronomic practice. Obviously, there's going to be some non-nutrient practices that they've identified as contributors to help them achieve that 18 megaton reduction, or megaton. I said metric tons reduction, but for the most part, they think they can do it with agronomic practice. So again, just a little bit of difference in perspective. These are two states. They share a border. They have fairly similar soils. At least the southern half of Minnesota is going to be fairly similar to northern Iowa. And they have dramatically different perspectives. And again, I'm not saying that one is better than the other. I'm just saying this is the perspective that these are the different perspectives that are represented out there in the landscape. If you're to look at what we've identified in Ohio, it's probably going to look a little bit different. And I would venture to guess that part of that's driven by the extent of tile drainage that we have, where we have the greatest amount of agricultural production in our state. So again, not trying to overwhelm you, just trying to expose you to what's out there in this space from the policy side and how we ultimately achieve these targets that have been identified. So let's get into a realm that I'm much more comfortable with, and we're about halfway through, is the scientific reality. So I like to play a lot of what if games, and I do that for a reason, because whenever I see something promoted, regardless of what it is, I always start asking these questions. So let's just focus on rate for the time being. What if we just reduced rate to meet the target? For right now, we're not going to concern ourselves with the agronomic outcome of just a simple rate reduction. That's ultimately going to be where we're going to go with this conversation. But what if we just, we're just going to start cutting rates because we think that's a way that we can achieve these targets. What does the data tell us about how changing that rate would impact yield? So if we just said we're going to cut to that 25 and that 45, what would be the outcome for yield? So I just want to show you some data. I've stolen a lot of this data, and forgive me for having I thought I got rid of all the animations, but apparently I had not. This is Ohio, so I have contributed a fair amount of this data myself. You're going to see some specific data that I have access to from when I was an academic. I've got 90 site years that I had collected myself. Well, it wasn't just work that I had done myself. It was graduate students, it was extension educators, it was on-farm cooperators. There was a lot of individuals that make up the data set that I still have access to. But this 228 sites, Steve Coleman is sort of the purveyor now of that information. I don't necessarily have visibility on all that information, although I suspect if I asked Steve really nicely, he would be willing to share it with me. Maybe I will at some point. But this is just to show you the broad diversity in nitrogen response that is represented across a fairly small geography. And when I say fairly small, I'm starting to focus, as opposed to just the upper Mississippi, I'm starting to focus on Ohio. So these are 222 separate nitrogen response experiments conducted across the state of Ohio. My suspicion is he's using some of the data that I had in there before, which goes back to even my days, before my days at Ohio State University back in the late 90s. So from 90s to, I suspect, all the way up to 2018. I don't think it has any 2019 data in this particular data set. That's sort of irrelevant at this point. But all I really want to show you is that the average response for corn following soybeans, that's the other part of this I haven't shared with you. This is corn following soybeans. The average marginal return to nitrogen rate is at that 180. So for those of you who are familiar with a lot of the strategies that have been deployed across the Midwest with regard to making nitrogen recommendations, everybody's sort of migrating to this economic-based model that is based upon an average response to nitrogen. We can separate that out geographically. Something I've said for years, and I don't know that 228 sites is adequate enough, believe it or not, to do this, but you could potentially have different models for different soils, drainage classes, different organic matter levels. If you can imagine it and think of it, you could probably potentially come up with a way to draw a different average response function. Now, whether or not that would actually result in different response is a different conversation, but potentially there's the opportunity to expand these nitrogen models beyond where they reside today. And I know that individuals like John Sawyer, Emerson Nafziger, when he was at University of Illinois, they have done a lot of this work to look at, okay, do we have different response to nitrogen in different, based upon different environmental factors? Obviously, crop rotation matters. Corn after soybean has a different nitrogen response than corn after corn. Should we make adjustments based upon organic material drainage classification, blah, blah. I mean, use your imagination to come up with what other potential things that could be used to identify an average response function. But for all of these 228 sites, this is that representative nitrogen response. Now, we don't actually have the nitrogen response. We have the net return to that nitrogen investment. So that 180 is about where that target is. So what available on the site, they also break this out. So this is just a frequency distribution of how often the nitrogen rate falls within these ranges. Now, this is the economic optimum rate. So what we actually have the opportunity to do with these kinds of models is you can say, okay, let me calculate what the optimum economic nitrogen response is for a given production environment, that being, i.e., every field experiment that is contained within this data set. So this is the percentage of sites that fall within these ranges. And all I want to point out is this. If that 180 is sort of our target, and I've sort of drawn some boundaries. So I'm saying anything between 150 and 200 is about where MRTN says we should be. How frequently is that the optimum rate for all of the field experiments that represent the database? And it turns out it's somewhere in that 35% of the time. So 35% of the time, that 180-ish rate is going to be about the right rate. So what does that imply about the other 65% of the time? And this is one of the challenges and opportunities on the agronomic side. If we could ever figure out when this environment is going to be experienced by the farmer, number one, it would be a tremendous value to the farmer in the form of nitrogen savings, but it would also be a tremendous environmental impact by identifying and recognizing, you know what, I don't have to supply that much nitrogen into this production environment, and I'm not going to take a yield hit associated with that decision. That is a challenge. Again, we could spend a whole day talking about what sort of technologies exist to maybe do a better job of identifying a better rate of nitrogen. But this is the reality of the challenge that we have today. And I don't want you to walk away and assume that these 0 to 25 pound economic optimum nitrogen rate sites are always the low yielding sites. My experience leads me to believe that that's not necessarily true. And in fact, I know some of the data that's in this model, and we have some sites that can grow 220 bushels of corn with 0 nitrogen input. I wouldn't bank on that every year, but those kind of field environments do occur, and it would be really nice if we could figure out a way to identify that. So all I really want to represent with this is part of the challenge of just straight flat reduction of rate is we're already sort of exposing at least 25% of our population to a yield loss because of inadequate nitrogen supply with the current recommendation methods that we're employing. That's just the reality of the situation, good, bad, or indifferent. So that's the story for Ohio. I just want to show you that it's not just specific to Ohio. You're going to experience the same thing as you move to the I states. This is Iowa. The one thing you probably notice that's dramatically different is the MRTN rate. Understanding the difference in the soils in these two environments, that doesn't necessarily surprise me that their optimum average nitrogen rate is 40 pounds less than what we typically experience in Ohio. But again, you get the same kind of a distribution, maybe a little bit tighter towards the center. So if you're in that 100 to 150, you're going to be more than 50% of the time, you're going to be hitting, or approaching 50% of the time, you're going to be hitting that right rate. There's going to be those production environments where you're going to be undersupplying, and there's going to be those production environments where you're going to be oversupplying. So really the way you think about this is when we're undersupplying, we're exposing ourselves to agronomic risk. If we're oversupplying, we're exposing ourselves to environmental risk. And don't just assume that these represent no environmental risk just because we happen to hit the optimum rates. We're going to see some data here in a moment to illustrate that point. But again, I just want to illustrate for you the broad differences that we can see with regard to nitrogen response. And one of our greatest challenges, and I spent 7 years as a professor at Ohio State. I spent 5 years as a graduate student at Oklahoma State University looking at techniques and technologies that could potentially be implemented at the farm level to do a better job of identifying nitrogen rates. I'm not going to say we haven't had any success, because we have, but there's also some limitations associated with some of those practices. And again, I just don't have time to cover all of that this morning or this afternoon. Again, just another illustration of what Illinois looks like. You're getting the same thing. MRTN is sort of in between. It's sort of a transition between Iowa and Ohio. MRTN for Illinois is about 166. And again, about 30% of the time, you're going to be under recommending, and about 35% of the time, you're going to be over recommending. Boy, wouldn't it be nice if we could identify when these production environments are going to be experienced by the farmer, because then we could do a much better job of dialing in the right rate. Not just resulting in improved economic return, which would obviously be a positive, but also recognizing that in these production environments, yes, there's going to be an economic payback, but there would also be an environmental benefit to not supplying nitrogen when it's not going to be consumed. So just to put this on a little bit different perspective, because I am a dollars and cents individual, what ultimately is going to drive farmer adoption of any agronomic practice or change in his agronomic procedures is going to be driven by economics. So this is just, I'm shifting gears just a little bit. And the only reason I'm doing this is a pretty detailed analysis, and it requires to have a lot of high resolution information. So this is the 90 sites of nitrogen response that I was responsible for when I was at Ohio State University. Again, I keep saying it wasn't just there was a lot of individuals that contributed data to this data set. We don't have enough time for me to list all those individuals. But what we have is this nitrogen rate. We have average return to that nitrogen dollar, what the average yield is, and then something that I'm really keen on, and that's probabilities. I'm a statistician, one of my biases, so forgive me, but it's really, when you're talking with farmers, you're really trying to convey the concept of risk and risk mitigation. So if I supply this rate of nitrogen, if I supply 167, okay, so for my MRTN model, as you notice, Coleman had added a lot more data sets. Interestingly enough, the data sets that he's been collecting actually increased the average MRTN. That's just the reality of the data. That's the other great thing about these databases as they exist today, is they're constantly being updated. That should give you, as a retail agronomist, a consultant, or a farmer, that should give you some level of, make you feel a little bit warm and fuzzy that they're always refining this and always updating it. I'm get somewhat nervous about things that never change. Things are always changing. It's just, what sort of scientific evidence do we have to substantiate the change that we want to implement? So my average MRTN was 156. If a farmer supplied 156, your average return would be 566.25. The average yield would be 169. If you actually looked at the agronomic optimum nitrogen rate, it's going to be somewhere around that 180, at least for the data set that I have access to. And then the question is, can a farmer live with 8 times out of 10, you're going to achieve 95% of max yield? That is, from the farmer's perspective, that's something that they've, from at least my interactions with farmers, that's something that they can get their heads around. It's not just what this number is, because when they see lower rates, they immediately think more risk. That may or may not be true, and we have the data accessible in a form where we can actually calculate what the risk is. What's really interesting, and where I really think the opportunity is for these databases, I hope John or someone from one of the land grants is listening to this. I think the real opportunity for this is, so even though average response function may not be all that dramatically different, like different soil classifications have you're not necessarily going to see a dramatically large difference in the optimum nitrogen rates. But my suspicion is it's probably going to play out here on the probability side is where, okay, on this type of soil, if I put on this slightly lower rate, my risk of yield loss is a little bit, it's not quite as much or as much for a farmer to take on from a risk mitigation perspective. So thinking back to my initial question, which was, okay, let's just say we're going to reduce the MRTN rates by, let's just say 25%. So that's going to get us somewhere in this 130 to 110 range. What does that translate into as far as dollars for the farmer? So that's $6 per acre return less. If we're closer to that 110, now we're approaching almost $20 lost because of the selection of a nitrogen rate that was well below what we know to be the average. Now you got to take this in context. Now this is on average, this is going to be response, because I know that there are going to be some fields that 110 to 130 is the right rate, and your marginal return to nitrogen, that is the right rate. But on average, this is the kind of decrease in economic return associated with those lower rate decisions. And that makes intuitive sense when you think about what potential yield loss that farmer is exposing themselves to by selecting a lower rate. With regard to probability, and this should not surprise anybody, as you decrease the rate of nitrogen that's supplied relative to where that MRTN is, you increase the probability of achieving a lower percentage of 95% of max yield. So 4 times out of 10 with this rate, am I going to hit 95% of max yield? If I just went with 90, so if I'm getting closer to that 45% reduction level, now I'm talking $36 per acre lost revenue. My risk of yield loss due to inadequate nitrogen supply moves up even further. And all I'm really underscoring here is that rate alone is probably not a lever that's going to be easily pulled to really promote a change in the amount of nitrate that's flowing down the Mississippi, because the economic penalty just becomes too great at the farmer level, unless something changes dramatically with regard to our commodity structure here in the US. So dropping rate is not necessarily all by itself a viable option for economically for the farmer. And something we don't often do a very good job of is translating that to a societal benefit. So what is the societal benefit of cleaner water in the Gulf of Mexico relative to the societal benefit of a abundant and cheap food supply? This is the game that we're having to play. But let's change hats. Let's say, what is the environmental benefit of simply decreasing rate? Now, part of the challenge that we have on the environmental metrics associated with changing nitrogen management strategies at the farm level is access to data that allows us some visibility of what ultimately happens when I change that nitrogen rate. What does that translate into with regard to nitrate loss? There are data sets that do exist. This is not going to be exhaustive. I don't have enough time, but those are a little bit limiting. It's, we have 228 sites in Ohio. There were 224 sites in Iowa of nitrogen response. We don't have 224 sites of nitrogen response and also some sort of environmental metric like nitrate that is potentially leached or is actually leached through that system. So we are a little bit limited, and that's just the nature of conducting science in the current structure that we have. There's always limitations with regard to data. But we take the best data that we have at our disposal and we start looking at things. So this is nitrogen rate response, and this is nitrate nitrogen concentration in leachate coming out of these systems. And what you notice is, number one, that I always like to point out is, if we stopped applying nitrogen in the state of Iowa, you do not stop nitrate loss from our soils. We do have a certain amount of nitrate that is mineralized, formed every year from our organic fraction of our soil, and some of that can be susceptible to loss. So just turning off nitrogen supplementation is not going to turn off nitrate nitrogen flowing down the Mississippi. So if we get closer to this 140 that they've identified as an optimum rate, what do we lose environmentally associated with adoption or promotion of that rate? Well, we go from about 7 to about 11 or 12, somewhere in there. Now, the other thing with this is you look at this data set and it's pretty much a shotgun blast. What really turns it up here at the end is this higher rate of nitrogen that we often implement or include in our experiments. Now, these may actually result in higher yield and sometimes even higher economic return, but they also translate into a much higher environmental risk. So what I think the take home from data like this is, I think the optimum rates, the average optimum rates that we've identified are going to get us at least down the road to approaching or at least getting closer to the targets that have been established. These are the sort of outliers that we have to really try to avoid. And again, I know there are justifications for supplying higher rates of nitrogen in some production environments. Don't get me wrong, don't misunderstand. But do recognize when you make those higher rates of application without some really good justification, you do increase the risk of greater nitrate-nitrogen support. Now, unfortunately, in the interest of time, I see I'm already at 45 minutes, and Chris, I apologize, I'm a long-winded speaker. Just want to roll through this pretty quickly because I do want to get to some concluding slides. Cutting rate would decrease nitrogen concern, but it's not that dramatic. So the one thing that I do want to point out is if we go to 140 down to 100, how much have we bought ourselves with regard to decreased nitrogen being lost? Not a whole lot, but you think about what that means economically for the farmer, going from 140 to 100, that potentially could be a lot of dollars that are moving out of that system. And again, in our commodity-based economy that we're operating in today, that's just the reality of the situation. Going from that 150 to 120, or that 150 to 160 pounds, which is the two values that they had represented in their model and the data they had collected, we're pretty close to that 120 with regard to nitrate loss. Again, zero nitrogen does not translate into zero nitrate loss. Anything that's in excess of the right rate, and I have my right rate in quotes, can result in excess nitrate loss. Could we do a better job of making recommendations? I think there's some opportunities. There's a lot of technologies that exist in this space to help us do a better job of this. This is yet to be determined. And even those have their own challenges associated with adoption at the farm level. So Chris, I'm gonna shoot for 1250 and then I'm gonna stop talking and start answering questions if there are any.
Sure, no problem.
All right, so a lot of discussion on rate. And again, we could have dragged that out for another 2 or 3 hours if you would have been willing to listen to me for that length of time, and my suspicion is you would not. The impact of changing timing, so going from fall to spring and then potentially from spring to splits, what do we gain? Okay, so take this for what it's worth. This is only one experiment. And part of the reason I pick on these experiments is because these are some of the few experiments that have the agronomic metrics and then also the environmental metrics. Now, because I'm really condensed with regard to time, I'm not going to have a lot of time to spend here, but all I really want to illustrate, this will all be available to you. Lowell presented this at the ASA meetings, I want to say 2 years ago. I believe it was 2018 is when he presented this. So I'm sort of stealing some of Lowell Gentry data out of University of Illinois. So I've got this 120, that's a spring application. This is a 160 fall. This is a 160 spring. This is an 80 fall, 40 spring, 40 side dress. This is 80 spring, 80 side dress. This is 80 spring, 80 side dress with a cover crop. So with regard to agronomic performance, everybody seems to be doing relatively well. The only one that was the risk was that lower rate of nitrogen. So that 120 for Illinois, for this experiment, that wasn't quite a high enough rate of nitrogen. If I supplied that rate, I'm going to lose somewhere around 20 bushels per acre. Okay, so that was 2016. 2017 looks like a fairly similar story. Statistically, that 180 doesn't separate itself out from the other 5 treatments. My guess is if you combine these sites to come up with an average response over these 2 site years, this is still going to be a lower yielding production practice. Okay, so do we see much of a benefit from going from all fall to all spring? And again, I have to say, within the context of this experiment. That's always a caveat that is associated with when you're dealing with just a single data set to really draw a conclusion. The conclusion that you can draw is only based upon the information that you collected. So changing application date didn't necessarily change corn grain yield all that dramatically. Again, admittedly, this is a small data set, and just take that for what it is. You could argue that moving from all fall to any fall is beneficial. You couldn't necessarily make that argument with the data that I just presented. And then even more pointedly, economically, does this impact farmer profitability? Is the additional application cost associated with splitting that nitrogen justified economically? And I'm not going to be able to go through all of those calculations. You individuals that work with the farmer have a better feel for what those numbers look like anyway. What does this mean for nitrate loss, though? And I'm not going to be able to go through all of this data. It's just not enough time. All I really want to show you is that 160 fall and that 80 fall. That's the blue and the red lines here at the top. So this is cumulative nitrate nitrogen load from these different treatments. If I had some nitrogen supplied in the fall, it was at a greater risk for loss. And more specifically, and if I could go through the previous slides, what it would reveal to you is it's really almost single event losses that translate to this higher risk associated with that fall. And that makes total sense. If I'm supplying that fall anhydrous and I follow the guidelines that have been identified for managing fall anhydrous, soil temps are low enough that I'm minimizing that ammonium being converted into nitrate, what is the risk? If I have a pretty cold winter, I don't really see a warm up, my spring is not excessively warm, how much nitrate do I potentially lose? What's the risk of nitrate loss? Well, it's relatively small. But if I get into that one environment where we had this a couple of years in central Illinois, a couple of years ago, I remember it was over the Christmas season, soil temperatures got up north of 50. We had a really good warm stretch of about 7 to 10 days. We started seeing tile lines flow. We started seeing some nitrogen move. Okay, that's a worst case scenario. And those kinds of loss events represent the lion's share of when we do lose nitrogen from these fall applications. That's just the risk of that application. So as you compare fall versus something that's more targeted to spring or even targeted into side dress, you do have a decrease in the amount of nitrate being lost. The question becomes, how sizable is it, and does the agronomic practice that has to be implemented, is it economic for the farmer to adopt? And again, I apologize, I'm completely out of time. This is some Iowa data. The only point I would make here is that more northern latitudes, it seems like we can get away with that fall application of nitrogen. Again, it is rate dependent, as is evident here. But the difference between fall and spring, if the nitrogen rates are reasonable, is pretty small. And that makes sense if you think about where you are latitudinally. Typically going to be a little bit cooler winter, less potential for conversion of ammonium to nitrate, decreased potential for that to be lost early in the spring before we ever get a crop planted. EEFs, they do have some opportunity. Again, I just don't have enough time to go through this. Let me just get to my conclusion slide. And again, I apologize. Let me just say this about cover crops. This is a question. I'm not saying these things to be contrarian. I'm saying this from a point of genuine concern with regard to how do we expect farmers to do these things. Who's ultimately responsible for paying for the practice of utilizing a cover crop? This is a publication from 2018. I'm just going to read this last line. And I think this represents a lot of the economic work done in this space, is that despite farmers' positive perceptions about cover crops and the availability of cost share programs, calculated annual net returns of cover crop use were negative for most participants. That represents a challenge. And again, I don't know how we necessarily overcome that, because I do think cover crops have some utility in helping us achieve the targets that have been identified. This is another question that I often ask, is what about rented ground? Who's ultimately responsible for implementing that cover crop? This gets even a bigger question when you start talking about bioreactors and wetlands. My humble opinion, that's probably more the responsibility of the landowner for those type of systems to be implemented rather than the leaseor. But again, that's my own bias and my own perspective. I'm gonna open it up to questions, Chris. I apologize, I went over. And if there's no questions, okay, I can finish up.
No, I think what we can do is maybe use some of that data you were going to show to answer some of the questions. We'll see if that works. But
perfect.
For everyone out there, if you do have questions that you want to submit, please do so now. I do see some of them coming in, but I suspect there's probably even more out there. So submit at this time if you want. All right, first one. And I think this goes back to roughly slide 11. I was trying to watch when these were coming in. It was basically your response curves to nitrogen application with grain yield. Yep, there you go, right around there. And this individual asks, and I think you touched on it a little bit, maybe expand on this. Can you improve the air rates by taking into account previous crop, soil productivity, other factors along those lines?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, so let me give you a little bit of my perspective. I'm going to go to Ohio because again, I'm intimately involved in some of this data collection. And the point that I often made to farmers specifically when they ask that question is ultimately, yes, you probably can. The challenge becomes developing a robust enough model to give you enough confidence that it really represents what the reality is. And I know that sounded really jargonese and very scientific, but let me just point it and let me just say this. So the first thing for those of us who manage nitrogen in Ohio, the first thing that comes to mind is drainage classification. We know that a poorly drained soil is going to behave differently with regard to nitrogen loss potential than a soil that is more well drained. For those of us who operate in Ohio, that's untiled fields and tiled. And it seems like there's very few untiled fields anymore. But should that change what the right rate of nitrogen is? Intuitively, as an agronomist, I would say yes. It's just, do we currently have enough data to take those things into account in the model that we have today? And I was arguing at the time, I probably needed 1,000 site years of information to really get to a point where I could say, okay, if your organic lab, and again, I don't even know if this could potentially happen, but just conceptually, if your organic matter level is below 2, here's what your average rate response to nitrogen looks like. And that may look dramatically different than what your average rate response to nitrogen looks like if it's between 2 and 3, and compared to if it's between 3 and 4. You'd be hard pressed to find, although there are pockets in Ohio where we have organic matter level higher than 4. But ideally, yes, it should. The challenge ultimately is this: the environmental conditions that ultimately dictate what the right rate of nitrogen is are things that we really can't predict very accurately going into the growing season. So organic matter level matters, but it's really the growing environment that we experience that deals with two things: how much nitrogen from that organic fraction is mineralized. So that's a positive. So if we could do a better job of identifying, okay, because theoretically at least, higher organic matter should translate into higher nitrogen release. So that's a positive. But the negative is, because we do have higher organic matter, we tend to have better internal drainage. So we might have a potential for a little bit more leaching, and there's at least a smattering of data that would suggest that. So while I have a plus on the high organic matter, if I have a high rainfall environment that's moving a lot of water through that profile, and if I have specifically if I have a piece of plastic about 30 inches below the soil surface that's carrying off excess water, and with it it's carrying nitrogen, what is the negative? And that is the real challenge to generating nitrogen recommendations, because we have things that contribute nitrogen in the form of mineralization, and then we have the things that take away nitrogen, that being leaching and denitrification. And how do we find that, and how do we predict those things? I know there's a lot of models that exist out there in the space. Some of them are owned by various companies that try to account for this, but what you realize really quickly about those models is they're only valid in season, right? So they're highly responsive models to what the growing environment is. And I think that's wise, because it's really hard to predict what's going on and that's going to be occurring in that soil environment when we're traditionally making our nitrogen rate decisions, right? That's typically fall if you're in a lot of the Midwestern I states, and in early spring side dress as you moved a little bit further east to where I live. So great question. And ideally, yes, we would be able to get to that point at some future date, and hopefully we will get there.
Yeah.
But recognize there's always going to be some challenges with identifying optimum spatial nitrogen rates. And I haven't even talked about spatial variability. That's a whole other conversation.
Right, right. Well, we can get into that just a little bit with this next question that I have submitted to me here. And that is, do you think there's value in using ground sensors or aerial imagery to improve nutrient management and water quality?
Yeah, so I knew someone was going to bring that up. And interestingly enough, that's before I actually came to Ohio State. I worked for a small precision ag company. I suspect a lot of folks are familiar with the green seeker technology. A lot of the agronomic technology and even the engineering with that particular sensor was done at Oklahoma State University. Worked with some great engineers, Marv Stone, rest his soul. We lost a great man a few years ago. He was one of the champions of that technology from the engineering side. My advisor, Bill Ron, one of the agronomists that was working in that field, that mentored a lot of graduate students working with those kinds of technologies. I do think there are a lot of opportunities for those kinds of technologies to help us do a better job of identifying optimum nitrogen rates. The bigger challenge, and if anybody's familiar with Newell Kitchen's work, I can plug here. Newell gave a presentation at ASA last year, and Chris, you'll have to, we were in San Antonio because I remember it was really cold, which it should never be cold in San
Right,
Antonio.
right, yep.
Newell gave a presentation. I think it was something like walking through the dark without a flashlight and trying to find something, and he was speaking specifically about identifying optimum nitrogen rates. I just butchered what Newell made a presentation on. If you're an ASA or triple SA, you should be able to access that presentation. I would highly encourage folks to go check that out. So those technologies can do a lot for us in helping us to identify spatial variation and even temporal variation with regard to nitrogen demand. The biggest challenge with those technologies, and I say this a lot, so I know John Fulton, Ohio State University, I'm name dropping like crazy, but I do interact with a lot of these individuals that work on this cutting edge of precision ag. From the engineering side, engineering is not our limitation to doing a better job of making nitrogen recommendations. The engineers are not at fault. It's more us as biological scientists and agronomists. It's the algorithms that we employ with these sensors that is the main limitation. And a lot of that is driven because of changing weather factors that occur throughout a growing season. So I can give you an example. I worked very closely and spent a lot of my time with some of my graduate students at Ohio State University trying to develop algorithms for Ohio. And I would say they worked relatively well. Some of the other folks that have evaluated them would probably disagree, but at least from the experimentation that we had conducted, they worked reasonably well. There was the occasional failure, and I'm like most individuals, you tend to remember your failures more than your the times when you've been successful. But that failure was very striking to me because when we went out there at V8 to look at our corn plots, it was actually one of my PhD students' plots, we could not pick out the zero in check from any of the other nitrogen rates that we had supplied. I think we went up to 220 or 240 pounds of nitrogen. The entire field looked green. And we honestly thought, holy cow, this is going to be that production environment where we don't need to be supplementing much in the way of nitrogen. And then it started to rain. So the other thing I think that this illustrates is you need to be a little bit flexible if environmental conditions do change. So that sensor can tell you, if you're looking at NDVI, whatever reflectance index you're looking at, there's a myriad of them that exist out there. If the sensor tells you that things look good today, you have to be able to respond to changing environmental conditions if they change. Because my suspicion is, had we not changed, if the weather pattern hadn't changed, our identification that zero in or something closer to 40 pounds of nitrogen was going to be the right rate, that probably would have come to fruition. But because that growing environment changed so dramatically after the information was collected, our recommended rate using the sensor was not even close. We needed that 200 pounds of nitrogen in that production environment to maximize productivity. So does that technology represent some opportunities? Absolutely, it does. But because we are so sensitive in the world of nitrogen to the environment in which our crops are experiencing, if something dramatic changes after you've made the decision, you probably need to have some opportunity to come back and reevaluate that field. If things continue on as planned, like the other 15 experiments that we did, they all worked reasonably well. But that one data, that one site, just always gave me heartburn. And in fact, it actually changed our algorithm slightly in response to that. But it's just the reality of the situation. So do those technologies represent some opportunities? Absolutely, I think they do. But then we had to start having a conversation about what's the economics associated with implementation of those technologies. And again, that's a whole other presentation. So no, I think those do provide an opportunity for us to do a better job of managing nitrogen input into our crop production system.
Okay. We're just a couple minutes over, but I want one final question. And I know some of you have submitted questions that are a little more specific. And Robert, if you don't mind putting up your last slide, if it has your contact information on it.
It should. If
these
it didn't,
individuals, you can give it out verbally too.
Oh, darn it. And that's what happens when you hit too many times.
It's okay. We can give that out verbally. Oh, there it is. Okay. So for those of you who posted questions and we didn't get to them, please look at the screen right now. But I want to finish off with one question that I had, and maybe you can tell us just a little bit about Nutrien eKonomics. What is that program? How does it complement maybe what some of the other fertility information is out there? Why should individuals visit this site and glean that information from there?
Certainly, and thank you for that. So again, this site was started in 2012, and the ultimate desire for the site was to take a lot of the scientific information that's available out there. And I've said this a lot to the academics that I'm privileged to get to rub shoulders with. There's a lot of great thinkers in this space. They have a lot of good information, and I will say this to them: I call myself a recovering academic. We're scientists. We're not necessarily really good at condensing information and presenting it in a form that's accessible by people who don't have a lot of letters after their name. So the real goal of this site is to take a lot of the information that's available out there in the space and condense it into a form that hopefully impacts decisions that are made at the farm level. We have a lot of tools that we make available to users of the site. We have a GDD calculator. We always get those questions. I know I used to write an article for one of our weekly newsletters with some frequency dealing with, okay, where are we at with regard to GDD accumulation in this particular growing environment? We have a GDD calculator on our site. So if any individuals are interested in that kind of content or that kind of material, they have questions about GDD calculation, it's available on the site. We have a rainfall calculator as well. So it'll give you an idea of what your rainfall, what level of rainfall has been experienced in a certain geographic area. The other tools that we really have that we really promote are ROI tools, specifically return on phosphorus and potassium fertilization. The basic concept is there's a lot of models that exist, and all of the data that exists on our site is from a publication of some kind, whether that's a peer-reviewed journal article or an extension gray literature. We rob pretty regularly from a lot of different content providers. But basically what we're trying to educate folks on is, okay, if this is your soil test potassium level, there's some other information that we have to collect as well. What should your expected return to that investment be? And again, all of those models are based upon published crop response models from various land grants. And even beyond the land grants, we even get into to provincial universities in Canada. And then we have some areas where we're just frequently updating what's out there in the scientific space, what's going on in the P&W with regard to nutrient decisions. How can farmers make better decisions in cotton production in the southeastern United States? It's really highlighting what a lot of the university scientists are providing with regard to guidelines and management practices to farmers. We're just trying to put that information into a little bit more digestible form. Not trying to take credit for what these other scientists are contributing, because we always link to their sites, but it's just trying to put this information into a centralized location where it's easily accessible by individuals that service the farming community.
Great. Well, perfect. And so folks who are out there listening to this, you can obviously look at your screen right now and see what the location is for that. Again, nutrien-economics.com. So, well, we are out of time, folks. I thank you all for joining today. Robert, thank you so much for the presentation. You covered a lot of ground, brought a lot of interesting knowledge to us, and we thank you for that. Thanks so much for your efforts.
Chris, I appreciate it. And everyone out there, have a great day, and hopefully we'll have a better growing environment, although yields weren't that bad. But we'd like to have a little bit less rain this year if that's at all possible.
Yeah, easier spring would be nice, no doubt about it. Well, thank you, everyone. And again, please be on the lookout for future webinars coming up in the months of March and April. You'll see a lot of good stuff coming your way. So for everyone out there, have a great day. Have a great week. Take care. Bye-bye.